Hi. I think we'll get started. Welcome. My name is Christina Weil, and I'm the co-founder and co-president of the Association of Print Scholars. This is Brittany Salisbury, who is also co-founder and co-president. And we are just delighted to see such a large response to this event. I hope to book Madison Square Garden, but the Pope beat us to it, and we're really glad that you all managed the difficult travel situation. So many of you in the audience may already be familiar with the Association of Print Scholars. APS launched almost a year ago in October 2014. And we are a nonprofit professional organization dedicated to supporting innovative scholarship about printmaking and facilitating dialogue among our members. And as of today, we have over 370 members who come from all over the world and represent a range of professional careers. We have curators, academics, grad students, paper conservators, artists, and print dealers. So it's a very exciting, diverse group. So in addition to hosting public events like this, we also have our website, www.printscholars.org, and it's now a resource for people in the print community. It's a place where members can post about recent news, opportunities, and events that may be going on in their world. Earlier this month, we awarded the first annual Schulman and Bullard Article Prize for the best article by an early career scholar. It's a $2,000 prize, and we're really very pleased to be able to give that now every year. And last year, we organized member events for our members in Paris, Berlin, and so we invite you to join APS or just simply attend any of our next events. On November 7th, we're hosting a major symposium at Hunter College. It's an all-day symposium with speakers ranging from graduate students all the way up to very established members of the print community. And then in February, we are also sponsoring a panel discussion at the College Art Association's annual meeting in Washington, D.C. So we also, before we get started, just need to thank a few people. We could not have done this without the support of the International Fine Print Dealers Association and the Art History Department here at the Graduate Center. And particularly, we'd like to thank Michelle Senecal at the IFPDA and Claire Bishop and Andrea Appel at the GC, and several APS officers who've done a lot behind the scenes to ensure that the RSVPs have gone well and that the event was running smoothly. So Allison Chang and Catherine Alkauskas helped us with that. So we're having a reception after the lecture. It'll be upstairs on the 3rd floor in the Art History Department. When we're all finished here, you can all matriculate over to the elevators, and there'll be signs directing you from there to where the reception is being held. So now I'm going to turn it over to Brittany, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Christina. So my name is Brittany Salisbury, and like Christina, I just wanted to thank everyone for trekking out in Midtown at its worst to be here today. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Peter Parshall. He probably requires very little in the way of introduction, since even those of you who don't imagine yourself to be print scholars have probably read his work. Peter served as the curator of Old Master prints at the National Gallery of Art in Washington for over a decade before retiring in 2010. Prior to his time there, he served as the Jane Neuberger Goodsell Professor of Art History and the Humanities at Reed College, beginning in 1971. He completed his PhD in art history on Lucas van Leyden at the University of Chicago and as a fellow at the Warburg Institute in London. His extensive list of scholarship includes the 1994 book, The Renaissance Print with David Landau, and the exhibitions The Unfinished Print of 2001 and The Darker Side of Light, Arts of Privacy 1850 to 1900 of 2009 to 2010. He's currently researching the curator William Ivins for the Metropolitan Museum of Art's 2016 exhibition, The Power of Prints, The Legacy of William Ivins and Hyatt Mayer. Peter's incredibly substantive body of scholarship in itself would have made him the perfect fit for APS's inaugural lecture. But what made us think of him immediately is the way in which he has done so much to encourage new ways of thinking about printmaking. Peter has produced scholarship that has required reading not only for his own subfield of old master prints, but for scholars of 19th century art and everything in between. When organizing this lecture, we had a vague notion that we hoped it could deal with a broad, innovative topic that would prompt people to think about print scholarship and the state of the field as a whole. We couldn't have been happier with the lecture topic that Peter proposed, Why Study Prints Now? Please join me in welcoming Peter Parshall.
When I first received this invitation, I imagined myself putting together, as I indeed went ahead to do, a kind of wonky lecture for print junkies. But then as things progressed and the time drew nigh, I started receiving telephone calls from friends in Georgia and California and Germany and so on, regretting the fact that they weren't going to be able to come to New York. And I thought, well, the audience is getting bigger and bigger, not the real audience, but the potential audience, which is a kind of remarkable testimony to the organizers of the event, who I think maybe should give this up and go into advertisement instead. Anyway, the lecture as it came out was a kind of a meander, a reflection on various things that seemed to me to be interesting and important about the history of this field. And it takes a number of turns. I think it contradicts itself at least once, maybe twice, and comes out someplace. And we can talk about that in the question period. But I thank you very much, given that it is a magnificent day outside, Pope one way or the other, and you have chosen to come in here in the dark. So my appreciation for that. Many years ago, I was sitting in an audience like this one when an esteemed colleague rose and addressed us collectively as those who love prints and other works on paper. I remember being a little disconcerted at the time by this association, not because I don't, in some personal respect, have an affection for prints, and even a love for certain of them, being that they have been the subject of a good deal of my professional attention over the last half century. But even that is not enough to presume the presence of an emotion such as love, even allowing for its debasement in informal conversation. The remarkable thing about this frequently declared passion is that it was acknowledged well over 300 years ago as something particular to those with an interest in prints. I refer here to the well-known and infamous satire of the print collector given by the French writer Jean de la Bruyère in his Caractère, composed in 1688. The passage describes a private collector's obsession with the etchings of Jacques Callot. Quote, "Will you look at my prints?" asks Demoised, and in a moment he brings them out. You see one among them neither well printed nor well engraved and badly drawn, more fit to be stuck against the wall of some house. He assures you he has the only one in all of France, for which he paid a very heavy price and would not part with it for the best print to be found anywhere. I labor under a serious affliction, he declares, which will one day cause me to give up collecting prints. I have all of Callot's etchings except one, which, to tell the truth, so far from being the best, is the worst he ever did, but which would complete my holdings. I have hunted for this print for these 20 years, and now I despair of ever getting it," unquote. 1688. Parody aside, there has been a long and extraordinary sense of identification with the medium of prints among those who study and collect them. This may be partly a defensive reaction to a prejudice against the replicated image being a minor art, but this is a matter of being historically uninformed. It is failing to understand that throughout the Renaissance, a print, being as it was a finished and marketable object, was likely to be more highly valued than a drawing. And although that order of priority has changed in the eyes of many, even today the cost of a rare print will often exceed that of a comparable drawing. I've recently experienced the potency of this attachment to works on paper in response to an essay I wrote for the newsletter of the Print Council of America. There, I addressed the current responsibilities of print curators and whether we were being unduly concerned about our future. The essay raised a question about the long-term importance of maintaining staffs of specialists assigned to care for an individual artistic medium rather than, say, an historical period. Not surprisingly, it touched a nerve. I shall return to this matter later on, but it's best to warn you that my remarks are meant as a caution about what it means in 2015 to be structuring an art history and an appreciation of objects according to the medium in which they are realized. It would be perfectly reasonable to dismiss this question as pedantically academic or touchingly sentimental, were it not for the fact that prints in particular inspire such curiously intense allegiance. However, in reflecting on this history from our current perspective, we need to take into account an important factor that I, for one, will not claim to understand with any degree of subtlety. That is the so-called digital revolution. It's a commonplace to say that we approach the past through the mentality of our own time, and after all, why should it be any other way? But the case of printmaking at present is significantly overdetermined. The much acclaimed reinvention of printmaking, now 600 years behind us, has supposedly given way to a digital world that portends the imminent displacement of the printed text and, by extension, also the printed image. Whether or not we consider either event to be a revolution, this is the rhetoric being employed. My point is not to comment on the truth of either, but only to underscore the fact that it places a heavy weight on understanding these events. Historians such as ourselves, whether we be revolutionists or evolutionists, have something at stake in the discussion. Thus, it is useful to consider how our thinking about the history of printing, and more specifically printmaking, has evolved. Overall, it seems fair to say that the impact of printing in Europe and the Americas has been retrospectively seen to be positive. A more effective means of communication across a wider spectrum of the population has been seen to benefit the majority in the long run. It has been a force for liberation and free expression and an aid to populist movements. It has provoked censorship, but then contrived the means to overcome it. On the negative side, we have, among much else, the encouragement to public slander, the invention of new forms of state propaganda, and the sensationalist press. The list, pro and con, is now being mirrored in a very similar way in the discussion of the so-called social media, a topic I spend more time trying not to think about than thinking about. There, too, the current assessment seems on balance positive, although plenty of concerns have been raised, not least about the internet, the anesthetization of the population, a so-called global community being orchestrated by invisible powers that have yet to deliver the bill. All this has to some degree been worried about before, although certainly not in comparable circumstances or in comparable terms. The European Renaissance, in one of its famously self-congratulatory moments, proclaimed that the printing press to be among the three great achievements of modern civilization. In this pantheon of discoveries, printing sat alongside gunpowder and the magnetic compass. No one yet fully understood that all three had been developed in China many centuries before. But in European hands, these inventions became, in their respective ways, all means for the extraordinary exercise of power. Given what followed as a result of the voyages of discovery, the claim made for their importance was hardly an idle boast. Consequences aside, for the moment, how did it all get started? The manufacture of paper had been practiced in the West for at least 2 centuries before it became widespread. But papermaking only appeared in Germany at the close of the 14th century, shortly before the earliest known woodcuts showed up in Central Europe. Literacy seems to have risen gradually throughout this period, but did not spike at any point. Likewise, the demand for books gradually increased, probably encouraged by monastic reforms, but neither in itself seems to have caused a major effort towards mechanical reproduction. After all, building a simple printing press required no more than available skills and materials once its purpose was made clear. And anyhow, the makers of the earliest woodcuts didn't need them. Although a sufficiently refined means of making metal type was a considerable achievement, the basic casting techniques were known. Whatever finally provoked the development of a means of printing, it is a tangled chicken and egg problem. But then what was a print in the 15th century anyway? The woodcut you now see on the screen is not among the first of its kind, but a generation or two after the earliest European examples we know. Much smaller than an average business card, it's hardly prepossessing as an object. But then it is also not just a knockoff postage stamp of a saint to pin on your hat. This is, of course, Saint Veronica displaying her veil with the imprint of the face of Christ on it, one of the many stories surrounding the Passion and the supposed origin of several much venerated miracle-working icons. I won't go into the details here, but suffice it to say, the dark silhouette of the Holy Face references a specific line within a tradition of images of the face of Christ, and probably a specific relic, something that may or may not have been known to our woodcut's first possessor. Its exceptionalness may explain the abrasions on the surface that probably indicate touching and perhaps also kissing. The simple outline of the woodblock printed on vellum, the more costly substance, not paper, underlies the addition of paint, gold leaf, and silver leaf. In short, it reveals rather little of its initial manufacture. It is a very special, quite obviously unique object. Whoever it was that first acquired it probably pasted the image into the cover of a prayer book to give it a suitable context, protection, and ready access. Its auratic power we cannot know, but surely it was there, despite its distance from the holy image it now evokes. To what extent does calling this a print tell us anything about its individual and cultural history? Although Veronica is an extreme case, it does make a point about the value of a multiplied object. The fact of its multiplicity may have nothing to do with how it is regarded by a respondent who, after all, possesses a thing that is unique. In other cases, it may be of importance to know that owning something, that one is a participant in a community of sorts whose members are largely unknown to one another, but nonetheless able to feel a kind of fellowship. In short, the fact of being multiple affects the value of the thing by choice, not by ontology. In the beginning, prints were likely never considered as multiples in the way we think of them now. Let us look briefly at some points along the road in the historiography of printmaking. This story goes back a long way, acquiring its first significant landmark in 1662 with John Evelyn's remarkable and insufficiently known treatise, Sculptura, or the History and the Art of Chalcography. Best known as a diarist reporting on the mundane activities of his class, Evelyn was in fact a polymath and a founding member of the Royal Society in London. He wrote about air pollution, forest trees, numismatics, horticulture, and much else, including this lengthy treatise on engraving undertaken as part of the Royal Society's planned history of the mechanical trades. Evelyn's treatise is notable for being the first concerted attempt to provide a comprehensive history of a single artistic medium. And I do mean comprehensive, for he genuinely sought to provide an account of the history of engraving in the broadest possible sense, from prehistory to his own time and global. There is even a section on antediluvian times. Engraving begins with incision and relief. Thus, ancient inscriptions as well as Egyptian and New World hieroglyphs, and the finger of God inscribing the tablets of the law, a weighty precedent indeed. Evelyn rooted around furiously in lexica and thesauri through classical and rabbinical and early Christian texts, inferring dubious etymologies and improbable terminology in order to explain the origins of tools and techniques. Although mainly an encyclopedic concoction of erudite pedantries, it is nonetheless surprising that he knew, for example, about Chinese and Indian practices and their antiquity. He also had a substantial collection of several thousand prints of his own and held strong opinions about artists and techniques. The Carracci are great, but Rembrandt is too gloomy and depressing. He writes about the larger cultural and societal ramifications of the print medium, its effectiveness in educating the young and in transmitting knowledge about the appearance of things, its service to antiquarians and the new science, its capacity for conveying visual records, and so on. Evelyn, however, does not regard the invention of printing as a revolution, either in technology or in thought. On the contrary, it was by his lights the result of a glacial development traceable to the very fog bank of prehistory. Yet Evelyn was interested only in what he called engraving, the more prestigious of printmaking techniques, even though the earliest works he knew were woodcuts, a medium that receives almost no attention at all. It would be a century before something comparable was done for that medium. In 1766, Jean-Michel Papillon, a French designer and block cutter, published a 3-volume work on the history and technique of woodcut. The lineaments of modern print scholarship, freed from mythology, merge in a pronounced way only during the mid to late 18th century. The ground rules for what constituted proper historical study had long been debated, and the relative importance of material and textual evidence reconsidered. In the 1770s, Edward Gibbon completed The Decline and Fall of Rome, and Denis Diderot's richly illustrated encyclopedia was moving to its unstable completion under heavy opposition for its progressive views. For uncovering the early history of printmaking, which meant investigating the origins of the woodcut, we must turn to Karl Heinrich von Heineken, a student of literature and law, and later secretary and librarian to Graf Heinrich von Brühl, a powerful figure in the Prussian court and a collector of exhibitable knowledge. Among his duties, Heineken was charged with accumulating a collection of art and natural history, including a substantial print collection that was, in fact, his special expertise. In 1746, he was appointed head of the Dresden Kupferstichkabinett, a separately founded civic institution dedicated exclusively to prints. In 1771, he published his volume in French titled A General Idea for a Complete Collection of Prints, which includes a history of the medium. Like Evelyn, Heineken was essentially an antiquarian preoccupied with the origins of printmaking. But his ambitions were more modest. They involved practical matters, chiefly when and how printmaking got going and who was the first to print books. It was generally agreed that rag paper was the key to the origin of the technique, but there was very little information available on the subject. It was, however, assumed that the earliest prints to be made were woodcut playing cards, and that the demand for these frivolous attractions lay behind the whole enterprise. As to concrete evidence, it was Heineken who identified the famous St. Christopher, then in the Buxheim Monastery library near Lake Constance. This discovery met with much acclaim, especially in Germany, anxious to defend its priority as the inventor of printing itself. When the book was later sold off to an English aristocrat, it was deemed a theft of a national treasure. But then 2 generations later, Heineken's claim for the priority of the woodcut was vigorously challenged and is now agreed to have been created at least a generation later than was previously thought. As you must be beginning to notice, this entire story has a certain geekiness to it that makes it all the more lovable. In this case, however, the geeks have not prevailed, for despite a century of well-grounded doubt, the Buxheim St. Christopher can still be found all over the web, touted as the first dated print. It is a good example of the tenacity of misinformation once printed. At the same time, one must also be aware that due to its very nature, printing is the best documented medium of communication in early modern history, and therefore its prominence in our thinking is guaranteed. But that self-fulfilling prophecy does not make its actual impact proportionate to all that we seem to know about it. Like us, the 18th century was an era in quest of technical firsts, and in regard to printing with movable type, the uncontested blockbuster in the history of the press, the lines were drawn between Gutenberg of Germany, Lawrence Koster of the Netherlands, and sometimes even William Caxton, for being the first to print books. This dispute had been going on for centuries as a matter of national pride. The case for the Haarlemmer Lawrence Koster seems to have been based on Netherlandish block books and the idea that 20 years before Gutenberg, he adapted the block book format by cutting out the wooden letters and then arranging them as movable type. In 1775, Gottfried von Moor, the editor of the first Journal of Art History, confidently declared that Heineken's researches had, quote, served excellently to gag the mouth of those defenders of the mythical Lawrence Koster, unquote. Nonetheless, I've been told by more than one Hollander they were taught in school that Koster was actually the first to use movable type. There was also some discussion of the invention of printing involving a conspiracy with the devil. This centered on Gutenberg's collaborator Johann Fust, named John Faustus by English writers, and thus inevitably identified with the historical Dr. Faustus, a magician and alchemist who trafficked with the underworld, and so it went. The 19th century saw a virtual avalanche of books on the history of printing and printmaking, much of it repetitious, but all of it testimony to the avidity with which the topic drew attention. That said, despite its sectarian spats and love of self-mythologizing, the 18th century investigation of the origins of printmaking was in many respects a model of historical rigor. It made refined use of stylistic and philological evidence, library and archival research, antiquarian studies, and technical examination, all employed to good effect. It was a contextualized interpretation of a new technology and to some degree a model history of scientific innovation. And then, in the midst of it all, there came Adam Bartsch, steadily nurturing the gigantic mouse that would eventually consume the field of print studies. The Peintre Gravure, 21 volumes issued in less than 20 years, that most astonishing of all accomplishments in the history of cataloging. It is a document yet to be fully surpassed, and still the most extensive compilation to be found anywhere in the history of any medium. All of it done by hand without the help of photography, and needless to say, without a computer. The Peintre Gravure catalogs with notorious inconsistency what Bartsch regarded as original, quote-unquote, prints from the 15th through the 17th century. Following in the wake of the dealer and collector Pierre-Jean Mariette, and greatly dependent on his efforts, Bartsch organized the basic map of European print production, completing the corpus in 1821, at which point he retired permanently from the planet, legacy intact. Bartsch determined how prints would henceforth be classified and organized in most public collections, and for this Herculean accomplishment, he is rightly regarded as a hero to our profession. In practice, however, Bartsch's catalog is a well-scaffolded finder's aid, and in due course, it would flatten the landscape of print studies for more than 100 years, rendering it largely fallow as a field of social and cultural investigation. Although we could probably all think of exceptions, a cursory survey of print scholarship from the 1850s to the 1950s would tend to confirm the following profile. A marked shift from museum print collections ordered by topic to collections of masterpieces ordered by the art historical canon. A list of exhibitions, dissertations, books, and articles inclined to the study of individual techniques and monographic surveys dedicated to specific artists and schools. Add to this an intense concentration on the narrower aspects of print connoisseurship, discovering new states, chronicling plates and block deterioration, debating the aesthetics of the ideal impression. In other words, problems of a largely centrifugal nature so far as the historical study of the medium is concerned. The study and exhibition of prints, the most widely diverse and broadly interconnected of the many pictorial arts, became more self-interested. Likewise, the market and its clientele, private collectors and museums themselves, came to be driven largely by the pursuit of masterpieces, and especially of rarities, in a field defined primarily by its capacity to multiply images with a maximum of uniformity. The quest for particular states, unrecorded if possible, the preference for wide margins and proof impressions among old masters, and other anachronistic traces of the art of production came to lead the market for intaglio prints. Bartsch, who is typically vilified for his murky distinction between original and reproductive prints, might better be questioned for helping encourage rarity as a defining aesthetic category, and more worryingly, turning print curators into filing clerks. In many respects, all of this was a good thing. It salvaged oddities and helped reconstruct micro-histories that would otherwise have gone unattended. And indeed, Bartsch was only recording what the market had already begun to seek out on its own. As dealers in drawings, sorry about the one on the left. Anyway, can't be done. As dealers in drawings, the Mariette certainly understood the value of rarity, and by the late 18th century, publishers were issuing impressions avant la lettre with little treats in the margin in order to boost profits. And I'm referring here to the little remark, as it's called, in the lower right-hand corner of the print on the left, which is a lovely little landscape that was left there for people who had special access to very early impressions before it was taken away, and what you see on the right was added along with a lot of additional work on the plate. So these are what we might say contrivance very much of the market. Nevertheless, Bartsch's helpmeet, the peintre gravure, taken as a model, amounts to a narrow kind of art history, cleaving to the satisfactions of current taste and curiosity more than mainstream cultural history, that arena in which print studies had once been a pioneer. La Bruyère's hysterical caricature of Demoiselles had come back to haunt us, and in many respects, it was Joseph Adam Ritter von Bartsch who built that stage for its revival. Of course, it is neither easy nor comfortable to recognize ourselves in this picture, and there are a good many reasons for that. I would like now to look quickly at three cases in the more recent historiography of print studies, when it regained its greater dimension as a field. Let us begin in 1936, when the philosopher and literary critic Walter Benjamin, then living in exile in Paris, published the first version of the essay that would eventually make him a household name among print people. I mean, of course, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which first appeared in French in the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung under the editorship of Max Horkheimer at the Institute for Sozialresearch, later known as the Frankfurt School, and now I believe later relocated down the block. Not being readily available in this country, Benjamin's essay did not enter the discussion of prints until after it appeared in English translation in 1969. Nonetheless, it has interest for us as a culminating point in the historiography of the printed image. There is not time here to discuss the substance of Benjamin's complex thesis, but only to make 2 points about it. The first is to recognize that Benjamin saw profound social and political implication in the mechanically reproduced image, which he associated with an anti-elite form of communication, and thus a challenge to the established cultic, literary, and artistic canons. But more important, at the moment he was writing, he saw the mechanically reproduced image as being available for co-option by the disenfranchised. He saw it as a potential means of subversion within the fascist state. Far from understanding the replicated medium as constituting an independent category of creative expression with its own internal imperatives, he understood its historical significance as thoroughly embedded in society and politics. And in his own tortured moment, it was a possible means of creating a sense of common purpose and common identity among the powerless. It bore the potential for revolution. The second point I want to make regarding Benjamin's thesis is merely a clarification. Contrary to the way in which the essay is usually read by historians of prints, Benjamin's primary example of replicated imagery is film, not the conventional printed images as such. Benjamin was invoking the notion of an art for the masses, Massenkunst in German, and something of a buzzword in the 1920s. The mass media, promoted and feared by cultural commentators on the left and the right, became a force to reckon with, principally as a result of the perceived effect of printed propaganda during the First World War.